For people that don't know about the Kecksberg incident, can you fill us in a little bit about what happened that day or that evening?
Oh, sure. I can go back and we could spend days and days just talking about the Kecksberg incident. And this occurred on December 9th, 1965, late afternoon, approximate times around 4:47. Initially, the reports came in from the tip of Ontario, Canada, over Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, of this brilliant fireball, this fiery object moving across the sky. And I can tell a little bit of trivia about it. I remember that evening how things began to unfold on my end was that I was tuning into KDK Radio in Pittsburgh, the big radio station, and they had a talk show. It was called Contact. The host of the show was Mike Levine. And coincidentally, he had a guest on that evening, which I was preparing to listen to. His name was Frank Edwards, who was a reporter who had written some books on flying saucers. And tuned in the radio show and found it fascinating that basically the whole show is being focused on the series of incidents of this fiery object that was seen over the greater Pittsburgh area late that afternoon. And Mike Levine was interviewing witnesses. He was reading the Newswire story reports of it. It became the prominent news story throughout the evening. More and more information was coming in throughout the night. And I was running into the other room to watch the old black and white console TV to see if any reports came in. And lo and behold, KDK TV was breaking in with live reports where they were talking about the incident that something had reportedly fallen out in Westmoreland County, about 40 miles southeast of Pittsburgh. And as time went on, it got much more fascinating because reports came in that the military was now arriving in that small rural community to search for an unidentified flying object. And so it was a very, very fascinating night. I was 16 at the time, wasn't driving yet, and was not able to get out there, and couldn't wait till to read the newspaper the next day to see if it was going to be in the paper. And there it was. It was a front-page story in all the local papers, made national newswire stories. And now what you got to realize is that there was very little detail at that time.
Mm-hmm.
And what I've learned of the case happened over a period of weeks, months, and years.
Let me ask you, what was the government? What was the government's official story then? What was the newspaper? What were the newspapers saying it was?
Well, I mean, when you read the local paper, the Greensburg Tribune Review, the first main headline was "Unidentified Flying Object Falls Near Kecksburg," with a subline "Army Ropes Off Area." And then the next edition of the paper had a number of different stories in it, but one of the main stories that stood out was that searchers failed to find object. And it goes on to say that, yes, there was a search, but absolutely nothing was found in the woods, that the official line was that people had seen a bright meteor in the sky, that nothing had fallen, and officially that's how it remains today. Now, I can tell you, I remember very clearly within days after this happened that there was all kind of talk about this around the local community, and there was reports that people had seen a large military flatbed tractor-trailer truck carrying a large tarp object away from that area late that night at a high rate of speed. Of course, that wasn't mentioned in the newspapers. But I can tell you just a little bit of the story as the things go on that night. So anyhow, what we do know is this. This story is being broadcast all over the Pittsburgh area from the local radio news media.
Mm-hmm.
And literally hundreds of people came in from western Pennsylvania, descended into this small little farming community to try to see what this object was that had fallen on the ground. So not only did you have lots of people, but you also had reporters that came in from all the major Pittsburgh area radio, TV, and newspapers, who themselves became witnesses to the fact that while they didn't see the object, as most people couldn't from where they were, a lot of them reported verifying the fact that they saw a military presence on the scene that night. And what most people reported, again, now we know, is that there was a lot of what they believed to be Army. People reported Air Force. Some people, now we interviewed some witnesses who claimed that they either had contact with or saw what appeared to be NASA personnel on the scene that night as well.
Okay.
And very, very interesting story. Now, here's what we know now that we didn't know back at that time.
Okay.
This object, as it comes in over the greater Pittsburgh area. It moves out roughly southeast into Westmoreland County. This object moves in over the city of Greensburg, where I live. and it tracked out roughly out towards Route 30 East. But between Greensburg and Latrobe, it made a turn to the south. And people all along that area, all these little farming communities, see this object moving out there across the sky, moving out towards the mountains near Laurelville. And some witnesses say that object kind of hesitated, made another turn, began to head back towards Kecksburg, made another turn and went down into the woods. Now, those people who saw this object actually go down said this thing did not come down at a high rate of speed, like, for example, a re-entry of space junk or a meteorite. It came down relatively slow, like some people said, almost like a controlled landing.
Mm-hmm.
And then moments after it fell, there was a column of kind of a bluish-gray smoke that went up out of the woods, but it dissipated very quickly.
Mm-hmm.
And what we now know is that within a relatively short time after it fell, apparently a number of independent people ran down into the woods to see what it was. And they came across this large, semi-buried, metallic acorn-shaped object down in the wooded ravine.
What color was
it?
Was it copper colored? Was it silver?
Yeah, it was kind of an off gold, copper, bronze color
in
that range. Yeah. Now, one witness, and again, now you got to remember this was 1965. Now, there was very little information initially at that time, and of course, nobody knew exactly where it came down. What we did find out later, years later, was the fact that all these people were on this little narrow country road that surrounds this large wooded area. But what they didn't know was that the thing actually fell way on the opposite side of the woods down in a ravine, so they couldn't possibly have seen what fell from where they were.
Mm-hmm.
But there was a number of people that found their way into this little dirt farm road at the time on the opposite side, which is where most of the military activity was going on. And again, while you really couldn't see it down there, if you weren't down in the woods where it fell, you couldn't possibly have seen what it was.
Well, let me ask you this.
Right down at that location. Yes.
How soon after it supposedly landed or fell did the military begin to show up?
Well, there's a lot of stories about that, and I would say the majority of the military activity began to happen within several hours after it fell, where a lot of activity really began to be reported. But there are some people who swear that they began to see at least a military presence. I mean, maybe, let's say, a military jeep, something coming through that general area, not necessarily down at the site because they may not have known where it was, but that they began to see it within maybe an hour after it fell. But we can't 100% be sure of that, okay? And different people said different military vehicles were coming in, in pretty good numbers on different roads. I mean, some people said they actually saw what they described as a military convoy on the Greensburg-Mount Pleasant Road, which would be the main road coming into there and also going out. But there's a lot we now know that we didn't know then. And it wasn't until 1987 that we actually had found the first eyewitness to the object on the ground. And how that came about was, for years I would hold these large public UFO displays at a local mall, at the Westmoreland Mall in Greensburg. And it brought thousands of people in. And we didn't have a lot of information on the case back then. But we did have a little display, and there was a lot of people there, and I was apparently out for lunch or something at the time, and a fellow was talking to one of my associates there, and they were talking about Kecksberg, and this man and his family happened to walk by, and he was standing there kind of listening to the conversation, and he said, "Excuse me, you talking about the incident out there in Kecksberg?" And they said, "Yeah," and he said, "Well, I was a member of the search team that found the object." Well, of course, my assistant grabs him over the side, and he starts talking, and he says, first thing, like, "Look, guys, I don't want involved in this thing. I don't want my family involved." But they got a hold of me, and we talked, and he was offered to talk to us privately about it. Well, that turned out to be Jim Romansky, but it didn't go public until 1990 when Unsolved Mysteries did the season premiere on the show.
Okay.
But Jim was not from Kecksburg. He said that he was a volunteer fireman from one of the outside mutual aid fire companies and was called out to assist in the search of a possible downed aircraft in the Kecksburg area. So Jim's story was very detailed. He gave a lot of very good details and told certain things that if you weren't there, you couldn't have known. And anyhow, what his story was that he was called out to that scene with others. He did know most of the firemen there because they were from other communities. And they were going to conduct a search in the woods around there for what they thought was a possible downed aircraft. So he was with a small team, and they had walkie-talkies, and they weren't out in the woods very long when they got a radio call from another team that they had come across this object over by, another area over there. So they hurried over, and he's standing with others on this little embankment looking down at this object only several feet away, which is semi-buried in the ground. Now, they knew what a meteorite would have looked like. They knew aircraft, and they realized that this was something unlike anything he'd ever seen before. Now, Jim had been a machinist all his life, and he said this was the strangest looking color of metal he had ever seen. And he described it, he said, it looked like somebody took liquid metal and poured it into an acorn-shaped mold.
Mm-hmm.
And he estimated, from what he could tell, this thing's about 10 to 12 feet or more in length, about 8 to 10 feet in diameter, big enough for a human to stand inside of.
Okay.
At the bottom of the raised-up area, like where your acorn would be at the back, he said there were these raised-up markings on it. And he said it wasn't like letters, it was more like symbols.
But now let me ask you this.
Defined.
I'm sorry to cut it to you, but if that was buried in the ground, how could he...
Semi-buried. Part of it was raised up out of the ground.
Got it.
Because it was underneath. This was raised up above the ground.
Okay, got it. Okay.
So anyhow, they're standing there several feet away, and they're looking at this thing. And he said there's no rivets, no seams, no fuselage, no weld marks, except for those unusual markings raised up on it. And they're amazed at what they're looking at there, and they couldn't see any way to get in or out of it from what he could see where he was. And, of course, it's dark. They have flashlights. And he said they weren't there very long when these two men in trench coats come down out of the woods, and they're very stern. And they tell these guys, this area is now quarantined. You have to get out of here. And right behind them are soldiers coming down out of the woods. And he said the soldiers were so close to him, they were shining their flashlights on each other. But they were told they had to leave the area immediately, and they found their way back into the Kecksberg. When they got down there in that little old truck station they had, he said there was military there. There was military vehicles around there, which other people verified the story. Now, what's intriguing about it is a number of years before, in the mid-'80s, we were beginning to get some more details on the case, and we began to intensify our investigation. And we were searching down in that general wooded area, and we never told him a thing about it. And while as we were looking around there, we came across an area what appeared to be a pattern of tree damage, like a trajectory, where trees were knocked down the same direction, the tops of trees were broken out. We got a pretty good idea where we felt that something probably had fallen. We told him nothing. So he offered to go out to the area with us. He hadn't been there since 1965, so that was 1987. He walked around out there for quite a long time, and we said nothing to him at all. And he remembered certain details about the landscape, and he remembered something in particular about that immediate area. And he walked around, he found that area, and he said, you know what, guys, I think we're right on the spot. And I looked at my associate, and we couldn't believe it because that was right in the area we felt this thing probably had fallen. Now, a year later, we got an anonymous tip that there was another local witness who had seen the object soon after it fell. That was Bill Bullybush. He lived in Mammoth right over the hill. So we got a hold of him, and he'd never come forward, but he verified, yes, indeed, he had seen this thing. And so he was willing to meet with us. Now, you got to understand this is a large, large wooded area, and there's a lot of ways to get in and out of there. Well, Bill Bullybush was down on the other side of the hill near Mammoth, and that afternoon, late afternoon, he was out there in his car in the driveway tuning in his CB radio, and he heard some radio reports about this thing. He happened to look up to see this fiery object through the windshield of a vehicle heading from the little village of Norville out towards the mountain of Laurelville. So he ran out of the vehicle, went out to the edge of the driveway, and watched that thing move off in the distance up to the mountains. He said it kind of hesitated, kind of turned, and made a turn back towards Kecksberg. So he jumps into his car, and he goes up to the highest outlook, which that road they now nicknamed, they call Meteor Road. And he went up there, and it was almost dark. And he knew the area of the woods because he hunted down there. And as he's standing up there, down in the woods, he can see like blue, kind of like blue arcing. He said it was almost like kids playing with sparklers. So he knew there shouldn't be down there, so he made his way down through the woods. And he walked down through. Now, what he did, he told us a story as he's taking us from the top of Meteor Road the whole way down through the woods and across the fields and way on the opposite side of that wooded area, a completely different area that the other witness had taken us to. But Bill takes us down, and he says, I was right here at this tree watching this thing, and he pointed over to the spot. It was the exact place the other guy had taken us to a year before.
Okay.
Okay, and then a third witness was John Hayes. John Hayes was a young boy at the time who his family was renting a little farmhouse down on the opposite side of those woods, down there, way down deep. It was at the end of that little old farm lane. And they had quite a number of kids. And apparently the military, being that it was the closest location, they were, I guess you could call it almost like a temporary command post that night. It was a small house, but these military people were coming in and out of the house and at times using their telephone and apparently reversing the calls because there was nothing shut up on their bills. But the kids were told to go to bed. But young John was fascinated by seeing soldiers and army trucks outside through the window watching all this activity going on. And he kept making the excuse he had to go to the bathroom, so he kept running up and down the steps so he could see these soldiers in his house.
Mm-hmm.
And he said at one point he heard a discussion that NASA would be arriving soon. And he said it wasn't long after he heard a knock on the door, and there was a couple guys there in these like white coveralls, and one of them had a NASA patch on. And so there were so many different stories that night. Now, here's what's interesting. Young John and the kids, the woods was their playground. They were down there every day. He had been down there the day before, and everything was normal. The next morning, the first thing they had to do, they had to mend the fence line because they had some livestock out there. The Army, the military, had cut that fence line to take their trucks down to the edge of that wooded area, that field, where they apparently loaded the object on. So you couldn't take the trucks down into the impact site because of the trees. And what we know is now they winched this thing up onto the flatbed right there on the edge of the field, we believe, and they had to winch it over because they couldn't take the trucks right down to where it came down.
Mm-hmm.
And when he was down there next day, he and his brother went down in those woods, and they were walking around, and they came across a man who had some kind of an instrument, and he didn't know if it was a Geiger counter or a metal detector, but the man talked to the boys and said, "You better get out of here because there's a chance of radiation." And the kids ran home and asked their parents what that meant because they didn't know what radiation meant. And so anyhow, that's just one of many, many different stories. But here's the end scenario, and we could talk about many, many other events and the interesting things that happened out there. For example, and I'll just tell you this right offhand.
Sure.
Over the years, many very competent witnesses have come forward. Now, you got to remember, a lot of the witnesses at the time were young children or teenagers who grew up to be. Some of them grew up to be very prominent people, but a lot of them turned out to be, teachers and law enforcement officers and school teachers. And one guy was a funeral home director. Was a very nice guy, a very prominent guy. And a number of these people came forward and said, "We were there that night." And some of them were teenagers who tried to sneak down into the woods to try to see the object, but they were stopped by military personnel. And in some cases, these people went on record and said they were stopped at gunpoint by military personnel who aimed weapons at them. Okay? Wow. And the question has been for years, where did that jurisdiction come from to go, first of all, on people's private property, and second, to aim weapons at other civilians on other people's property?
Yeah. And what was so important?
What was so important that they didn't want people to see. Now, there's a number of interesting stories. Now, the one that I'll just tell very quickly is, for example, he had a fellow who passed away several years ago. His name was Jerry Betters. And Jerry was a well-known jazz musician in the Pittsburgh area. And Jerry had a little farm between Pittsburgh and Greensburg. And late that afternoon, something scared the horses. It was a bright flash of light, and something scared the horses. And later he heard on the radio about this thing landing in Kecksberg. So he got a hold of some of his friends. He didn't have a vehicle at the time. And they drove out to the area, and they, among others, apparently found themselves on that same little dirt farm lane where most of the activity was going on with the military. And I guess their event didn't last very long, but they got onto this dirt lane, and he said, he saw the vehicles down there. He saw guys in white coveralls. But what he saw very quickly was most fascinating. At that point, he saw, and he drew the sketch and went on record, and he said he saw a large military flatbed tractor trailer on it with a big star like the old Army vehicles. But he said what was so odd was on the back of that flatbed trailer, the object, for whatever reason at that point, the tarp was not on it. And he could clearly see this thing moving slowly, trying to make its way up out of this field up towards that dirt road. and he described seeing a big metallic acorn-shaped object with the hieroglyphic markings on it. And he said it wasn't long they were there when this Army officer came down, started screaming at these young soldiers, "Get them out of here, get them out of here." They all pointed their rifles at them, and they made them get out of there very quickly. And but anyhow, I can tell you this, just the end is part of the story. In 1990, in the summer of 1990, before the Unsolved Mystery did their season premiere on the story, a man contacted me, and I was able to check his background out very thoroughly, and he told me that he was a part of the Air Force Police security team that guarded the object when it came in from Pennsylvania that night at Lockbourne Air Force Base outside of Columbus, Ohio. Okay. He said they were aware that something had been recovered in Pennsylvania, was coming into the base. He described how they brought it in, not the normal way they normally enter that base, which another witness also independently verified. It was backed into a hangar, and they said it was much higher security than even when President Kennedy had visited that base a number of years before. They were given a shoot-to-kill order to anybody who approached that hangar without the proper authority.
Wow.
Now, he said he didn't stay on that team that long, but he was told that from that point it went over to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base outside of Dayton near Fairborn, Ohio. Now, other witnesses independently confirmed that it went into Wright-Patterson, and we knew exactly what building it went to. Now, whether it's still there today, we have no idea. But I firmly believe, for what I know, that the military did recover this object, whatever it was, and they have it somewhere today.
Now, how many people would you say saw that being carried out by the military truck? Just that one guy that you said, or were there other witnesses as well?
I couldn't give you numbers, but there were numerous people.
Okay.
Yeah, and there's different people who have different. For example, just in the last couple of months, I came across another witness, and this guy didn't come to me. He happened to be discussing this with a local businessman who knew I was interested in this, and the businessman got a hold of me, and then I got a hold of the witness. And again, I'm still waiting for more details on this, but again, you're very thorough. He was a teenager that night. Again, he, among others, hearing the story of something come down. Now, he didn't see it come down, but he was standing there along that road when it came down on the flatbed truck, where different people described that, and he said he was close enough that at one point, part of the tarpaulin was lifted off of the one area. So he got a pretty good look at this thing at fairly close range, that part uncovered, seeing the object and some of the markings on it.
And he saw the same thing, the hieroglyphic marks, and
oh yeah, and a number of people have confirmed that.
What do you ever make any assumptions on what you think these things are? What you might possibly think it was? Do you yourself do that, or have you heard any theories about it?
Oh, there's many theories about it, and you know, I always have said and gone on record said I keep an open mind to all possibilities, and there have been many people over the years who have approached me and said they knew positively what it was, but when you go and talk to them and you look at the information, it doesn't fit what we know. I mean, first of all, you got to look at the fact that, one, this is 1965, relatively early days of the space program. This thing is relatively large. According to numerous reports, this thing is, before it fell, within several miles before it falls, this thing is moving relatively slowly. One witness, unfortunately, as many, is now deceased. His name was Randy Overly. He was a very good witness. He was a young boy playing with his buddy outside of Norvelt, and in the distance they hear this hissing sound. And they watch this object as it's beginning to approach their direction. And this thing comes over directly towards them, moving very slowly. He said it was almost like the speed of a small aircraft on approach to an airport. And it passes, he said, about 200 feet overhead. But it was very close enough. He got a very detailed description of this thing. He said it kind of was acorn-shaped, kind of a brownish, grayish color up in the sky, and there was some kind of a vapor around it. And there was different color flames coming out of it. But he said it was moving so slowly that you could see it very well as it moved out towards the mountains of Kecksberg. So he saw it approach, move overhead, and go off in the distance. And it was moving relatively slowly. And other people said as it moved, you know, it made some turns along the path, and it makes a relatively slow descent as it goes down to the woods. No parachutes reported. And, of course, in that area, had it been a meteorite or a piece of or a satellite reentry, there should have been a lot more damage at the scene, which there wasn't.
Right.
Various people confirm trees knocked down or broken trees at the site. Like young John Hayes said, he said, I was down there the day before. Everything was completely normal. And the next day, there's all these tree damage and trees knocked down, and it wasn't like that the day before. He said, there's no way that, that was caused by anything natural.
I wonder if anyone was in it, if it had any occupants. That's, I guess, something that. Do you ever think we're going to know the answer to that?
Well, I can tell you a little more about that part. That's not really well known. Okay. And this is information that's come in fairly recent years. And again, talking about the theories, I've had people who, the most logical explanation for years was that this is somehow related to Cosmos 96.
Mm-hmm.
Which was a Venus space probe that had re-entered the Earth's atmosphere coincidentally on the same date, but about 3:18 a.m. in the morning over Canada. This happened about 4:47 in the afternoon.
Mm-hmm.
But there's new data in recent years, without going into everything, that pretty much eliminates that possibility. Okay. Now, there's people who approached me with theories and ideas and saying they knew for sure, for example, that one said that he was sure it was a Russian ICBM. Another one said he knew there was some type of device, a projectile, that was fired from a giant railroad gun in Canada. Okay?
Yeah.
In more recent years, just recently, since there's been some books reading, people talk about this Nazi Bell theory. There's been all kind of theories and ideas out there, but when you really look at what we know, and even though there might be some similarities to it, it doesn't seem to fit. But again, I keep an open mind to all possibilities. And you asked me about, was there anything in there? Nobody can tell you for sure, but I can tell you this. It's not like Roswell, where people said they found bodies lying around, saw bodies out there. There have been rumors for quite a while that allegedly bodies were related to this thing,
mm-hmm.
but nobody's been able to verify that story. However, I can tell you, when I started filming for my documentary Kecksberg Event Told Story, okay? So anyhow, as I was filming this, and I should go back a little further. Back in 1990, when Unsolved Mysteries did their season premiere, once that show came out, it just opened up a floodgate for a lot of people to come forward.
Right.
So people soon after the show aired people who had moved from this area out of state that contacted me. Some were witnesses, others who had good information. There were others who had details. Some claimed to be, it may have military sources who want to remain anonymous.
Mm-hmm.
But there was one fellow who contacted me. His name was Myron. And Myron was a truck driver, and he said, I saw the show on TV, so I guess I'm allowed to talk to you about it now. I said, well, what do you mean? He said, back when that happened, he said, I was a truck driver working for this large warehouse in Ohio, a supply house. And he said, within a few days after this object fell, a Navy officer came to this supply house and ordered this very large quantity of special glazed engineering brick to be taken to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. So what we learned at that time was that there was two trips. The day before Myron was there, another truck driver took the first load into Wright-Patterson. Now, that truck driver at the time would not verify or discuss the story, but longer period of time after that, he did finally admit to it and did get myself and a couple other investigators working with me the full details of the case. He verified the fact that he was there the day before, that the trailer part was parked on the side of this building with the object on it. And he said it was covered over, and it looked like a great big Liberty Bell, is how he described it.
Mm-hmm,
The next day, he and Myron both went back to the base, but it was no longer there.
Mm-hmm.
And they were escorted in, told, just do your job, don't be looking around. And as time went on that day, Myron was watching these guys in like white coveralls with sidearms and different type of protective gear, and they were occasionally changing their outer clothing. They were coming out of this warehouse building, and Myron was curious, like, what's going on here? So when he didn't see anybody around, he went into the entrance, and he could see up in the scaffolding, described in great detail, seeing this big metallic acorn-shaped object with the hieroglyphic markings. There's ladders going up to it. It wasn't lit real well, and these guys apparently trying to get inside and open this thing up. So he began to ask some questions, And I guess at one point, one of the guys questioned him, finally realized he didn't have the proper clearance, and basically he was threatened and told him that, you can't talk about what you've seen. If you do, we're going to throw you in jail and throw away the keys. But in 20 years, this will all be public knowledge, which, of course, that didn't happen. And so anyhow, I had interviewed him. I went and interviewed Myron. And Myron was in very poor health. And if you see him on the video where he's describing this in the interview on my video, Kecksberg the Untold Story, which, again, people can get through my website at stangordon.info, he's on an oxygen tank, and I guess the night before he had talked to his son about telling us the rest of the story. In fact, we asked him, he said, why are you telling us now? And he said, because I may not be here tomorrow because of my health. And he went on to tell us, shockingly to us, that when he went in that building, he said he saw something else other than the object. He said there was a little table there, and on that little table, he said there was what appeared to be a small body that was covered over with a white sheet. He estimated it was about 80 pounds, about 4.5 to 5 feet tall. But he said all he could see was the left hand that stuck out from that table, and all he could see were like 3 index fingers, and he said the skin looked lizard-like. And, I tried to get him to, tell more, give more detail, and he kept saying, that's all I could see. There was nothing else. I couldn't see anything. All I could see was the arm hanging down. So we thought that was interesting. Well, it gets a little more interesting because, as you probably are aware, in 1972, the Sci-Fi Channel supported a group called the Coalition of Freedom of Information, which is basically being headed by Leslie Kean, the journalist that had a #1 bestseller on UFOs last year. So they chose Kecksberg to do this major investigation, and they got very deeply involved, and they got into some areas which I didn't have the capabilities to do. They tracked down different witnesses. They dug deep for information on the case, and this was making big local and national news at the time. So in 2002, there was quite a number of other new witnesses who came forward as a result of the fact that they thought, well, that was the time to do it because they're doing a serious look into this case. And there was a list of people. There was one name on there, and I'll call this fellow Joel. And this gentleman, his name had come up, I think it was about 13 years before, who was allegedly a witness who had been hiding down in the woods that night and had watched them as they watched the recovery operation of this thing by the military.
Wow. And
we contacted him at the time, and he didn't deny it. He appeared to be a little nervous, and he said, look, I just don't want to get in trouble with the government. So anyhow, that was it. He wouldn't talk to us. But here's his name in 2002 on the list again, and I recognized it right away. So I contacted Joel. So he was now retired, and he said, well, he was willing now to tell me more about what happened. So I made arrangements to get to his home as soon as I could. I went out there. When I got out there, he was a little nervous, and he said to me, look, he said, I was trying to get a hold of you. He said, I just want to cancel this because my family still gets me talking about what happened. And I talked to him a little bit, just give him a brief summary and discuss a little bit. And he said, well, I guess you're here now, so I might as well tell you a little more of the story. So he goes into and this went into a number of subsequent interviews as well over a period of time. And he went in to tell me that I believe he and his brother that afternoon had seen this object in the sky that was changing directions, which is what people would describe.
Right.
And later he heard it had fallen in this wooded area, which he had hunted in, so he knew it fairly well. And he and his brother went out there. And, again, it's pretty much dark by the time they got there. But he decided he was going to he wanted to go look, but his brother didn't want to get down. So he grabbed a flashlight and started making his way down the woods. And he kept his light out, but he could see, again, this like electrical arcing down in the woods. So he went down, and here he comes across this object. And he said he wasn't down there very long when some civilians began to come in. So he began to hide. He was hiding behind this tree just to watch what was going on. And he said it wasn't long after that the military began to come in. He said, look, I was in the military myself, and I know what military people look like and equipment or whatever. But he was hiding. He said at some point he began to actually pull some of the branches around him so they couldn't see him.
Smart guy, yeah.
And he said over a period of time, more and more military were coming in, and they kept setting up like perimeters around there, around the crash site, like more than one perimeter, and he had to keep moving back so they couldn't see him. And he's watching all this go on, and he said, and we're talking, it's describing the position of the thing, what it looks like, and he said to me, he said, there's some things right now, after all these years, I'm getting a little confused. I'm not exactly sure of this detail, but we got to one point, and all of a sudden, his demeanor completely changed. He started to get very nervous. His voice began to change, and he said, and sir, he said, I swear to God, sir, there was something inside of that thing. Actually, he called it the hickey. He said there was something inside of that hickey. And he brought up something else that was really interesting. He said, I just don't understand why they would have politicians down in the woods. I said, what do you mean by politicians? He said, yeah, there were men down there in black dress suits. And he said, they had a black hat on, black tie, black suit. And he said, these guys were telling the Army guys, the military guys, what to do. And he said they were taking all kind of pictures down there. He said, like of the tree damage, of the object on the ground. He said later when they loaded us on the truck, they were all around that area taking photographs. But here's where he began to quiver. And he said what happened was, he said there was an Army general down there. And this guy jumped on top of that metallic object. And he had like this long metal probe. He said it was like a policeman's billy club, but longer. And for whatever reason, he struck that thing with the object with that long probe. And he said moments later, there was like from the front area, this hatch opened up from the right to the left.
Oh my!
And he said all I could see from where I was, he said there was this long, almost like elastic arm that came up around it. He said from where I was, he said I could only see 2 fingers. And he said it looked like the stuff that kids used to play with, like silly putty, something like that. And it was just very elastic and elongated. And he said there must have been another arm, but from where he was, he couldn't see it. And he said it was like this unusual high-pitched swirling noise, and that hatch hit, and you could hear like metal on metal hitting. And he said at that point, that Army officer jumped out there and started screaming, hurry up, we don't have much more time. And that's when these soldiers all began digging around, and he described in detail how they strapped this thing with these metal straps, and how they apparently winched it over on the trucks and had to load onto the truck and get it out of there. Now, if you listen to that story, and you listen to the other guy who didn't know each other, it begins to make you wonder if there was something or someone inside.
Yeah.
And then there's the more little interesting aspects. For example, one of the witnesses, his name was Bill Weaver. And Bill is a very reputable witness. He was a teenager at the time. He had his radio on that evening when he heard the radio report that something had fallen over the hill not too far from where he lived. He was in his dad's vehicle. So he decided to make his way over there. He knew the general area, and he found himself again on that little farm road we talked about. And at some point he could see this bright object, way not in detail, but bright down in the woods. And various people were beginning to gather around there. And at one point, he said this big white box truck, unmarked, pulls up. And from out of that box truck, here's 4 men in what he called moon suits, like that white protective gear.
Right.
And he said they pull out of that truck some kind of device. He said it's like a big, I believe he said about 4x5 square box on like a stretcher. And they take it down into the wooded ravine. Now, this thing is far too small for the object. The question is, what were they going to put inside of this thing? And we learned from another witness that they actually had seen 2 of these devices down in that area. And so what was that all about? And also, something in more recent years we've now discovered, and I think we can pretty much confirm from various witnesses, that there were actually 2 military flatbed tractor trailers at the scene that night.
Okay.
We know the one with the object went out there about 1 o'clock in the morning. But apparently this other truck went out earlier in the evening, and whatever it was carrying, it was like a longer, flatter packaging of whatever this was. It was covered over as well. So the question is, what was on that truck that they took out earlier?
Wow.
And there's lots of speculation, a lot of interesting stories. And again, there's no way I can confirm any of these accounts. My gut feeling is that these 2 fellows are describing to the best of their ability something they actually saw and experienced. And if these guys are telling the truth, then we have a whole different aspect of this case that we just don't have answers for at this point.
Now, those guys in the suits, were they? Are you making the assumption that they would be what's commonly termed the men in black then?
Well,
Or
he described them as wearing black suits, and apparently a number of people described seeing some of these guys up on that farm road and down in the woods, and apparently they had a lot of jurisdiction, even over the military, from what different people described. So, again, who they were, what their position was, we don't know.
nobody ever claims that they were contacted or approached by anybody after the fact and told that they should not speak or anything like that in terms of anything they saw.
You got to realize there were so many people involved that night. And different people tell us it seems as though the military, the guys on the scene in different areas around there, were like not really, I don't know what the word I want to use is, but they weren't really maybe prepared for this type of thing, at least some of the ones they came in contact with. And there's some reports over the years of certain people who may have played a part in this, certain witnesses who kind of suggested that there was some contact with certain individuals, but a lot of the key witnesses were never contacted.
Okay.
But at the time, none of them at the scene, I mean, they didn't make anything about it. They kept their mouths shut. None of those witnesses ever went to the news media and talked about it. They all kept their mouths. They told some relatives and friends. They just kept their mouths shut because they realized they knew what they saw. And the next day, the article says there was nothing there, and the government says nothing was there. So most of these people just didn't talk about it. Right.
They wouldn't need any other. Yeah, they wouldn't need any other prompting. That would make sense, as a matter of fact. Wow.
There's just too many witnesses. I mean, the hundreds of people I've interviewed, and how many more out there is that we don't know have never come forward. And we know there's a lot of deceased people now. I mean, I have statements from other relatives and friends about people who they knew were involved are no longer with us. And, I mean, there was one story in which we can't confirm, but it was a relative of this person. It was a young girl who reportedly was one of the first people who ran down into the field to see this object, and she's reportedly touched it. And she said it was smooth as glass, is what she told the family members.
Now, I want to ask you, in terms of this incident, oh, wow, the question just slipped my mind, and I didn't actually have it written down because I really wanted to know just a little bit more. It's going to have to come to me. It's funny. I thought I had it. It was like right there, and then it slipped my mind. So now, in terms of any other incidences that occurred in terms of that period of time in Pennsylvania, is this like, say, maybe the premier incident that happened in that area? Were there other sightings and stuff that did occur around that time as well?
No, you got to remember, I was 16 when it happened, and there was not a lot of flow of information back at that time. I mean, that was the major case that got me very interested, even though my interest started when I was 10 years old. But it was after that case that I began to go out into the field and investigate. And 65 was a fairly active year in general across the country for UFO activity. But, of course, this was a very outstanding case, one which still today is drawing a huge amount of local, national, international interest on it. And, again, it's still unsolved because we just don't know for sure what this thing was. It came down.
Now, this is what... My question, actually, I remember. Any pictures? That was what I wanted to ask. Does anybody claim? Pictures? Yeah. Well, yeah. Actually, what we do know is this. There are a number of people who I've interviewed over the years who said they saw black and white photographs that were taken over different years, and we believe that there were pictures taken, but nobody's ever come forward with those photographs. And if somebody would, that would definitely help to clear that part of the story up. There's a lot of interesting little tidbits of this case, a lot of things that are very suspicious that happened during that time. I mean, and just one example, and it could be just pure coincidence, but I'll just give you an example. As I said, there was a lot of news media on the scene that night. I personally knew the stringers for almost all the TV stations at the time who were out there. Now, back then, they were using film. There wasn't video, okay? So this was a major news story in Pittsburgh the next day. It's shown on TV, the story. I remember seeing it on one of the channels. But, you know, how much all these stations have archival footage of all the old events that happened, and they can go back for many, many years, 30, 40, 50 years, and pull the footage. Yet we asked over the years all these local stations
the search for their footage at that time, nobody's been able to find that footage from that event.
Wow.
Now, it could be just coincidence, but it's interesting. And I personally knew the guys that shot that footage, and I've interviewed them, of course, too. And but that's just one of many little possible coincidences. Now, that's not to say that somehow they were misplaced or whatever, but interesting that none of the stations have been able to find it.
Well, it basically seems as if they don't want that they don't want that to be found. All right, let's leave Kecksberg to the side for a minute. There's a lot. You gave a lot of information on that. Certainly a lot more than I was even expecting to hear. Let's talk a little bit. I want to get into, obviously, a little bit about the cryptozoological part of things, but I want to tell you a little bit about Carbondale. And if you had did you do any research into that at all? And what about that incident? Because that's another incident where apparently some people claim seeing something taken away by the military and also military presence.
Okay, I was not deeply involved in that event. There were others at the time who were closer to that part of the state that went into that pretty deeply. There was a fellow who's now deceased. I believe his name was Robert Berry, who ran a UFO program. He was from up in that area, and I know he did a lot of research on it. I believe another researcher named Matt Graber was involved at the time, and he's done a lot of research in recent years on it. And there's another fellow who I know, his name is Rick Fisher, who I guess has been doing a lot of very recent investigation on. And I think he's last year he was trying to write a book on it. But, there was a lot of discussion on, there's a lot of controversy on, was this a hoax? Was this thing real? As I recall, the little bit of details, this was 1974. The people had seen this object reportedly fall into a local pond up there. And people came out and they saw some kind of a glowing object in the pond, and the police reportedly, as I recall, shot at this thing. But later on, as the investigation began to unfold, that a diver went in, recovered a lantern, which they said that was the hoax thing that they had seen. But from what I understand, others that could not possibly relate to all the information what people had seen out there at the time. Now, one thing I do kind of recall was that there was allegedly some information that possibly something connected with a Soviet rocket or some space debris possibly may have been involved, but I don't know if anybody's ever confirmed that story. Something happened back then, but what exactly it was, I guess there's a lot of discrepancy and a lot of controversy as to what it really was. But there are others out there who have really spent a lot of time looking into that case.
Yeah, I just saw, in my research, an interview with the divers, supposedly the divers, saying that the lantern had been thrown in by the sheriff to sort of put an end to everything. So that apparently is out there as well, that the diver has come forth and has been interviewed and saying that the lantern was a part of the town's own decision and it wasn't the boys or whoever else was involved in it. So that actually kind of throws another whole light on the situation as well. Are you familiar with that, or had you heard that, or anything like that?
No, that's a story that I've heard something along it, but again, wasn't directly involved, so I can't confirm that.
Okay. Well, let's move away from UFOs, at least right now for the moment. Let's talk about the wave of 1973. Apparently, in 1973, there were a lot of things going on in the state of Pennsylvania. You were very busy.
Oh, it was an amazing time to live through. And this is what my new book, Silent Invasion, the Pennsylvania UFO Bigfoot Casebook, focuses on. And I can tell you, some of the most dramatic UFO and Bigfoot and strangest case on record are documented in the book, because back then, my team of investigators were on the scene in many cases within minutes to hours after the events occurred, with a lot of the key events. And some strange stuff was going on. 1973 was the last major wave of UFO activity in the United States in fall of that year, which those who were around remember the news stories at the time, was making a lot of major national news of UFO sightings around the country. But it started in Pennsylvania on January 1st. It continued all year long up to the last day of the year. There were hundreds of UFO reports coming in. And many of these were not lights in the sky. Many of these, as described in the book, these were very close detailed observation of large structured objects, chasing cars, alleged landings, all kind of interactions with people, just amazing stories. So we were very busy with all the UFO activity. Now, just going back a little bit to give you history of that group, I found that, in 1969, I set up a hotline for the public to report UFO sightings. And I began to make contact with the local police and the news media about what I was doing. And back then, there was a lot of ridicule. But I went to these people and said, look, if you get these reports, even if you're not going to follow up on it, if you let people know that I'm interested, I appreciate, let them know I'm here. Okay. Well, over a period of weeks and months, my phone was ringing day and night. I was just being inundated, not just about UFOs, but anything mysterious. Alleged hauntings, strange creatures, you name it, the calls were coming in. Well, it soon became apparent I couldn't handle this on my own. And I knew I needed scientists and engineers and research people and technicians to evaluate these cases. So that was my goal, to set up a volunteer group of research people who could quickly respond to these incidents. And that was what I did. I founded the Westmoreland County UFO Study Group. And with my electronics background, I set up a very elaborate communication center in my home, a two-way radio dispatching system, so we could radio dispatch a lot of investigators to the scene of certain areas, and that we did for many, many years. And the group became very active. We had a lot of very prominent scientific people and research people and law enforcement people, and a high percentage of these people work with me anonymously because of their positions. But the group became very well known and became quite recognized, and it took on an area of respectability. So by the time these events began in '73, as these calls were beginning to come in, a lot of calls were coming into the police departments and news media, and quite often they were referring the calls to us to investigate. And back then, some of the incidents, the local or state police also investigated at the time. So anyhow, all this UFO activity was amazing, but it was in the summer of '73 when things got much more fascinating. We had this major outbreak of Bigfoot activity going on, and it wasn't just in one local area. It was going on through a widespread area of southwestern Pennsylvania and other areas of the state. And this went on for weeks and months into 1974. There were multitudes of Bigfoot sightings, many daylight, many at close range. And when I say close range, I'm telling you, there were witnesses within 5 to 10 feet of these creatures. In some cases, there were multiple creature reports. In many cases, multiple witness reports. In a lot of the cases, we would get out there with our investigators, and there would be various types of physical evidence at the scene. The most dramatic evidence I saw, and even some of the state police and others who were in some of the cases, something could not have been fabricated, was how the animals responded when these creatures were nearby. Now, while it was apparent with various animals, it was most common in the dogs. And here are cases where you would have normally ferocious dogs that should be barking and growling and carrying on. And now, when these creatures were in the distance, generally these things, the dogs would bark and carry on. But when they were close to the creature, they were like paralyzed. They would not bark. They would shake. They wouldn't move. They would hide in their housings or underneath dwellings. And it was amazing to see this.
Now, I remember. Why do you think that? Is this because they were considered food for these animals, or for the?
Well, I guess they have, but it seemed like maybe they were able to sense something. They're very sensitive to various things that we aren't, and they were able to perceive certain things. And and we know over the years that these creatures don't like dogs. I mean, there are cases where these things have gone after dogs, and dogs have been found torn up in some of the areas, and but that's just some of the things we found. But just to make this short, because I think we're already getting short on time here.
Yeah, I know.
As these events began to unfold, now we went into this open mind. I mean, we had heard reports of alleged Bigfoot sightings in Pennsylvania going back for many, many years. I mean, there was the Native American legends. There was articles in the 1800s, even in the newspapers in Pennsylvania. The earliest first-hand record I have of a Bigfoot encounter goes back to 1931. Up in Indian End, up there along the Chestnut Ridge, which is a reoccurring active area for all kind of phenomena year after year along that long mountain range. But anyhow, we go into this investigation thinking we're dealing with some type of unknown animal, unknown primate. And as time goes on, the police departments or ourselves were beginning to get calls from people who were very frightened in many cases, describing some very strange events. Some of these events involved where both the UFO and Bigfoot were seen at the same time and place, for example. Okay? One of the first reports I had came in from a rural area outside of Greensburg from a wife of a well-known doctor at the time. She had seen a large boomerang-shaped object hovering low over the woods that evening.
Mm-hmm.
And a few hours later, she was hearing gunshots down the road. And she found out later that a neighbor went outside to see why the dog was so upset, to see this large, hairy creature going after the dog, and he began to fire at this thing with his rifle as it ran off into the woods. So we thought, well, that's kind of interesting. You have a Bigfoot sighting. You have a large, hairy, Bigfoot-like creature in the woods. And then other reports began to come in from much further distant areas. For example, September 27th, up in Beaver County, almost the Ohio line, these two young women are standing outside in the woods waiting for a friend to pick them up when they see this large Bigfoot creature, which is white, covered with white hair,
mm-hmm.
and it's running across the road into this wooded area. And seeing that creature alone was very strange, but in one of its hands it was carrying a small sphere of glowing light, luminous sphere. And it walked into the woods, and a short time later, not too long after that, this object comes across the sky, and it, at first they thought it was an aircraft, but then it slows down and projects a beam of light down into the woods. So we thought, boy, that's really fascinating. And
interesting.
Yeah, other strange things began to go on. For example, we'd be out in the field, and we'd find areas of trails of footprints that would just suddenly stop and vanish.
Mm-hmm.
But the ground conditions were conducive for more footprints. It's just like the thing just suddenly stopped and vanished.
Now, have you gotten pictures yourself of the footprints? You have pictures of the footprints?
Oh, we made some wonderful. In the book, I have one of the most famous casts that we had taken of it. And what's interesting was a lot of the casts at the time, a lot of the footprints were large three-toed footprints.
Mm-hmm.
Even though others were being reported, it was mainly generally three-toed tracks showing up,
mm-hmm.
which, while it sounds unusual, in many parts of even in the Pacific Northwest and California, different areas where you have had a lot of history of Bigfoot reports, they've had reports of 3-, 4-, and 5-toed footprints showing up.
Mm-hmm.
And we've had, for example, 5-toed tracks out here as well, the more typical Bigfoot tracks. But
mm-hmm.
the point is, as time went on and these reports began to unfold, other cases began to occur. And the most famous case, and we could talk for hours about this case because some of the very strange aspects of it, but I'll just tell you briefly. October 25th of 1973, up in Fayette County outside of Uniontown, a rural area, I get a call from a state trooper who just came back from investigating this multiple witness UFO landing. But at the same time this object's on the ground, here's these two large Bigfoot creatures in the field at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what we find out is around 9 o'clock that night, there's about 15 people in this little rural community. They're observing this object. It's about as big as a barn. It's red. It's hovering about 100 feet above the ground, and it's slowly dropping toward the pasture. So this happened out on the farmer's son was visiting his dad, which is going on the father's property. So he and two neighbor boys decide to go up to investigate. So he goes in the house and grabs a .30-06. And he grabs some ammunition, which includes 2 tracers. So they're just going to produce a flash of light. So they proceed down the road, and they go up, start walking up towards the pasture. And when they get up to the top of the pasture, here's this object right on the ground or right above the ground. But now mm-hmm. it looks like a half a sphere, like a dome, but it's bright white. Now, as they're moving down to that area, they were hearing in the distance like this high-pitched, like a whining sound, and also like a baby crying sound. Mm-hmm. And as they get closer, these sounds are louder. Well, when they get up in the field, this whole object is making this high-pitched sound. They hear like a baby crying sound. This whole object is very luminous, and the whole area is glowing. The field and everything's luminous. This thing's about 100 to 150 feet in diameter. It's about 250 feet away.
Yeah.
And they're amazed at what they're seeing. And they're there for a short time when their attention is drawn to about 75 feet away. There's a barbed wire fence. These posts on the fence are about 6 feet tall.
Mm-hmm.
And when they notice these 2 figures walking one behind the other along this fence in their direction. Well, at first they thought they're bear, and then they realized, well, these things they're tall. One's about 8 foot tall. The other's maybe around 7 foot tall.
Mm-hmm.
They're humanoid. They're tall. They have very long arms hanging down almost past the knees. They're covered with long dark hair. They They have glowing green eyes. There's a strange smell in the air like burning rubber. And the one kid's very, very upset, and he soon runs out of the field. And finally, the other kid's yelling, shoot him, shoot him. So the guy fires a tracer. There's just that flash of light. He fires a second tracer. And when he does, the larger of the two creature reaches out as though it's going to try to grab that tracer round. And the moment it does that, the object in the field just vanishes. It doesn't take off. It just disappears. The light goes out, the sound stops, and everything's real quiet. And the creatures turn around and start walking back along the fence line towards the woods. Well, the guy at that point uses live ammo and fires right into it. He said, well, I've been hunting for years. He said, I know I hit that thing, but there was no indication neither one was wounded in any way or slowed down. So at that point, they run out of the field and they run home and tell the family what happened. They take them to a neighbor's house and call the state police. So the trooper arrives about 45 minutes later. And anyhow, to make the story short, they go up in the patrol car. They go up into the field where all this was going on, and the area where the object had been was self-luminescent and glowing. The trooper said it was about 100 feet or more in diameter.
So the object was now, it was gone now. It was no
gone,
longer
but
there.
It was a glow. The area around it was glowing. And he said it was bright enough that if he had a newspaper, he could have sat down within it and read from the light coming off that glowing area. He said the animals wouldn't go anywhere near it. He said that he aimed his flashlight beam to it. You could barely see the beam from the light. It was so bright.
Wow.
And anyhow, there's a lot more to this story, and it gets even stranger and stranger. And, you know, if people want to read The Solid Invasion, you're going to read probably one of the strangest stories you've ever read about. And more and more cases began to happen, and this went on for months and months into 1974. And I can just tell you, it was an amazing time to live through for the strange events that were taking place.
That sounds it really sounds like an amazing time, and I really wonder what it was specifically about that particular year, even worldwide, that there was such a huge display of paranormal activity. I want to remind our folks, the folks that are listening in live, that they can call in and they can ask questions of Stan. I believe we have somebody on the line now. We have Will, our guy Will from Pennsylvania. Hold on one second, from your state. Hello, Will. How are you?
Oh, how are you? Listening to your show today. Listen, I know you're pressed for time, so I just wanted to ask Stan 2 questions, and I'll listen off the air. Yeah, I wanted to ask you, have you ever had any Bigfoot reports in the northeastern part of Pennsylvania? Because you were talking about Carbondale, about the UFO landing, but about 3 months ago on our local TV up here, somebody had reported they had seen a Bigfoot in Carbondale. And my second question, if you get the time, I was also curious about the Thunderbirds, and I was curious, how large are they, the sightings you've seen? What's the size of a Thunderbird? And because I know you're pressed for time, so I'll listen off the air. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Will.
Okay. I can't tell you of any specific Bigfoot report I can think of in Carbondale, but there have been many. All over Pennsylvania, there have been Bigfoot reports. Almost every area of Pennsylvania has reported Bigfoot activity, while a lot of the activity is here in southwestern Pennsylvania, which may well be because I'm centered here and we have more input for those reports. But I know that between myself and the Pennsylvania Bigfoot Society and other researchers, I've looked at the hundreds of Bigfoot cases throughout Pennsylvania, and there have been reports throughout the eastern part of the state, northern parts of the state. So it's very possible there were reports up in that area. The Thunderbird reports are very interesting. It's one of those cryptozoological events that we talk about. And there's been a long history of these things being seen, especially up in the northern part of the state. But reports that come in from many other areas. I had a very interesting incident. It's on my website, by the way, it's stangordon.info. That happened last year, August 26th, not far from here in South Greensburg, Pennsylvania. And but generally, and again, while the reports are similar, there's also some variations in them, but generally, most of the bodies described as dark brown or black. And again, as with UFO sightings, there's no doubt that some of these are probably misidentification of other normal bird. However, some of the cases we have were extremely close-range, detailed observations. And I'll tell you one of the most interesting ones that I have, and I mentioned my first book. It's described in detail in Real and Mysterious Pennsylvania. It actually happened in a neighboring state in West Virginia, and that was in the fall of 2007. And this happened outside of Clendenin, West Virginia. And this gentleman was driving down the road early that morning on the 2-lane road when he had to hit his brakes because there's this huge bird in the middle of the road eating roadkill blocking the road. And gave an extremely detailed account of this thing stood at least 4 feet tall. It was taller than the roof line of his vehicle. And he gave an extremely detailed description of how this thing looked, the body of it. But he said what was so amazing was this massive wingspan that extended across the 2-lane road. And he said when this thing, the bird was looking at him, and he said the bird seemed as startled to see him as he was to see it. And he said he was almost like in a slight state of shock. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. And as this bird ran off, as they were trying to get off the ground, he said it moved in a very awkward manner. It was like jumping from one foot to the other, hopping, like flapping its wings, trying to get off the ground. And he said when it finally rose off the ground, he said it was stirring up the dust and gravel on both sides of the road. And when he went back to measure it, the wingspan across the road was, I believe it was 20 feet, and I'll look it up here in the report, but I'm quite sure that's what it was. It was 21 feet across, actually, across the roadway. This incident happened in South Greensburg, PA last year. You had 4 witnesses who were having a barbecue, and they happened to hear this loud, like a swooshing sound right above them, to look to see this huge bird about 35 to 40 feet overhead, and the beak was downward, like looking down at him, and he said at a minimum of a 10 feet or more wingspan on it. And, again, give a very detailed account of what it looked like. But they watched this thing flapping its wings, moving down the road till it went out and set over a group of trees and said it took about 20 seconds to a quarter of a mile distance and vanished.
My question,
reports are coming in. And
my question is... No, go ahead. Go ahead. I'll ask you.
Go ahead.
Well, I'm just wondering, with all of these different sightings and people seeing, why doesn't somebody just get their camera out and take a picture?
And, I ask that all the time. And for example, there were several people there at the barbecue. They had their cell phones right there. And I said to the guy, he said, you know what, we were such in shock. We were so startled. And that's what you hear, that we didn't even think about it until afterwards. And that's a very common thing. I mean, I remember a fella years ago in a park outside of Pittsburgh at daylight. And he had a beautiful, this is before digital cameras, in fact, and he had a beautiful long lens on this camera. He was taking pictures around the area. He saw these deer coming across the hill very quickly as they were startled to see this huge, hairy Bigfoot creature chasing after the deer. And he said, I just stood there in amazement. He said, the last thing I thought about was even taking a photograph of it. I was such in shock watching this thing running across the field.
I guess, I can understand that to a certain level. I can understand that. But the rest of us out here that are hearing all these fascinating stories, we want to see something,
Oh, yeah.
So we want to see something. Because, I'm sure so many people believe in what they hear other people saying. They believe because, there's so much more to life than we can even grasp anyway. So it's not unimaginable that these creatures can't exist. We just want to get hold of something, something. And
I agree. And, in the nearly 52 years I've been doing this now, I have never personally seen a UFO or a Bigfoot. I've interviewed thousands of people. I've seen lots of evidence at the locations of some of the events, but I've never personally seen anything. But there are occasions where people have taken photographs, and we're lucky. I mean, in really mysterious Pennsylvania, there's a very interesting photograph in there that was taken of a UFO in January of 2007, where some people riding in a vehicle, and they had just recently, a few days before, had purchased a new cell phone with a night mode setting on it, and they were riding down this country road to see this very large luminous object, kind of like a big dome-shaped object with a bump on the top and the bottom. It was very low, and at one point, they were able to pull off where it was unobstructed from the trees in the housing area, and they stuck out the phone and got one really nice, clear picture of this thing. And the picture's in the book Really Mysterious Pennsylvania. So there are occasions where people do take pictures, and there's, in fact, some UFO pictures in silent invasion from some photographs were taken in 1973.
Okay.
So people do at times have the capability to take photographs, and they have.
Well, we definitely would like to see more of them because, I would love to see, ultimately, a picture of a Bigfoot or a Thunderbird that is, unarguable, something that people can't debate about, and it's just like, okay, boom, there's the proof right in front of you. Because these stories, or these tales that you hear people tell, they're really fascinating. As I said before, it doesn't take much of a stretch of imagination to assume that these things do have some way of existing. Now, is there any particular portion of Pennsylvania that is, say, more of a magnet than any other portion? I know you were talking about around Chestnut, or the mountain range there. Is there a specific portion of Pennsylvania that gets a lot of sightings more than any other part?
Reports come in from all across the state, but I can tell you a recurring active area, and again, it's a large area, so over the years we've staked out with equipment various places, and still I've never seen anything. But the Chestnut Ridge, it's that mountain range that's 100 miles long. It runs from Preston County, West Virginia, to Westmore and Fayette in Indiana County. And it's an area that's had a long history of recurring strange events. UFO sightings, Bigfoot, other strange creatures, all kind of strange reports all along the Chestnut Ridge. And for whatever reason, out there in Derry Township, which is along the base of the Chestnut Ridge out around Latrobe, Pennsylvania, we still continue to receive almost year after year reports from different people of UFO and Bigfoot activity. Even in recent years, there have been some very, very interesting cases. And in the silent invasion and really mysterious Pennsylvania, there are some very detailed, very unusual, very close-range creature reports in those books. And why this goes on in certain areas, we have no idea. Just like, why did these major events happen during 1973 and 74? We've never had anything like that before or since. And, we've looked at this many, many times and tried to find, look into the geography of the area and check different things, and yet there's just been no explanation why this activity took place.
And what percentage of some of these incidences, let's say overall, what percentage of these incidences really turn out to be something that can't be explained? I know you said earlier that some of them may be a mistaken, somebody's maybe mistaken their vision, the depth of vision or something like that in terms of what they're seeing, or maybe the lights are explainable. But what percentage would you say are really unexplainable?
Well, with UFO cases in particular, a high percentage are misidentifications. Many turn out to be bright planets and stars, meteors, reentry of space debris, satellites. There's a lot of things. In recent years, there's no doubt even last year, there were a lot of reports of what apparently were people launching these Chinese lanterns or hot air balloons. So there's a lot of things that initially look strange, but they're quite often explainable. And it changes year after year. With Bigfoot reports, you've had misidentification of bears and large dogs and things along that line. But, for example, those events of 73, and again, we were there right after they happened in a lot of cases, within minutes to hours in many cases. And many of those cases were very well documented. I'm convinced a lot of those people saw and experienced what they saw. And since that time, I've interviewed hundreds of people who have claimed to have had Bigfoot sightings, and many of them, again, are very close range, very detailed accounts, which in some cases there were physical evidence at the scene to confirm a lot of what people described happened. But in a lot of crypto cases and other phenomena we deal with, many things initially seem very unusual. Quite often they're explainable.
Now, do all of these Bigfoot descriptions basically fit the same? Are they the same? Long hair, sort of extra tall, same coloring, or do they vary?
There is a lot of similarities, but there's some variations as well. We've had reports of the standard, if you call it the standard size, anywhere from over 6 foot, 6, 7, 9 feet tall. In some cases, very unusual, but rare that we've had some cases where there appear to be even taller ones. But in some of these cases, we had it where there was a way to confirm it. Okay, like in one case, a couple cases, they were much taller, but they were cases where the head of the creature was hitting a branch, You can actually, people can see it hitting and shaking it, so you can measure it. And a lot of these people were fairly close. The question remains, and this is what I bring up with silent invasion, if these things are real, and there are so many reports around the country and in Pennsylvania, around the world, just like the skeptics say, why haven't we come up with any bodies? And as I got into the events of 73, and we began to have some very strange cases, and we didn't get into some of these cases, which you got to really read the book to really get into it because we didn't have time tonight.
Okay.
It brought up the possibility that at least some of these cases we were dealing with something that was not a normal flesh and blood animal, which may well be the reason why we've come up with no bodies.
So you're saying that they're interdimensional, perhaps?
And that's one theory.
Okay.
Like I said, not just cases where we found footprints where there should have been more tracks, where it seemed like they just suddenly vanished, but it's a number of shooting incidents. And one very amazing case was very well documented at the time, February of 74, where a woman up in the mountains up there outside of Ohio Pile, she heard this commotion on her porch. This lady had lived in the woods all her life and pretty much not afraid of anything. There had been some wild dogs coming through the area, and she figured these dogs were back. She heard like these tin cans rolling around on the porch out there. So what does she do? She loads her shotgun with one chamber. And her thought is, I'm going to go out on the porch and shoot over their head and scare these dogs away. So she loads the shotgun. She goes over to the door. She turns on the porch light and steps outside. There's no dogs there. But just a few feet in front of her, here's this large, hairy, Bigfoot-like creature. She never called it a Bigfoot. She said to me, it looked like a great big hairy ape, but it had its arms straight up over its head. And she fires right into this thing with her shotgun. And she said there's this bright flash of light, like from a camera, like a strobe on a camera. And that creature just vanished right in front of her. It disappeared. And then her in-laws lived about 100 feet away, and they heard the gunshot, and they called her on the phone. She told them what happened. So the son-in-law grabs his pistol, and he starts making his way up towards her house, and he said he's surrounded by four or five hairy people with eyes like coals of fire. And he begins to shoot at him, randomly runs into the house. And at the same time, here's this object hovering over the trees, over the woods. So they saw like a big Christmas ornament with different lights hovering over those trees. So they're both very shook up, and they call the state police.
They got to stop shooting at him. They got to stop shooting at him. They need to. Well,
I've never recommended this, but it seemed like back at that time it was a reaction of many people who were badly frightened. The first thing they did was shoot at them without thinking.
Wave the white flag, offer them something to eat or something. I don't know, but just relax a little bit, folks. They're going to vanish if you shoot at them. But anyway,
well,
go ahead.
We know in their diet, from what we heard from different people and people saw, that they like apple corns and berries. So I would say put out more apples, and maybe that'll be something they might like.
Yeah. Take it a little easy on the poor guys. No wonder they vanished so quickly. Fascinating stuff, though. I mean, it's people, we go about our ordinary lives most of the time, and we hear about this stuff, and yet there are just all these people that you get in touch with you to see these extraordinary things.
And these things go on year after year. And I mean, most recently, and again, you can go and read the whole story on my website at stangordon.info, but a very unusual crypto report was just reported. The man contacted me, the witness, on March 21st. This has happened on March 18th up in Butler County, between the towns of Shakur and East Brady. And this gentleman, who I've interviewed a number of times, he was a businessman, early morning hours, coming through this rural area. About a quarter mile away, he observed something on the right side of the road, in the grassy area, which he thought it was a deer. So he stepped on the gas to move close, get a better look, and as he got closer, he had his high beams on. Here's this very tall, muscular creature, which appeared to be hunched over, and it stood up. And at that point, this creature walked in front of one of those big yellow reflective road signs. The guy had his high beam on, so he got a good look at it. And he said what he saw, and this guy said to me, he said, this is the freakiest thing I ever saw, and it made the hair stand up on the back of my neck. But he said this thing was it was a little taller than the sign, so it was over 8 feet tall. And he said to me, I've heard people claim they've seen Bigfoot up in this area. He said, this wasn't a Bigfoot because it didn't have any hair on it. He said, It looked like he had smooth leather-like skin, kind of a dark tan or light brown color. And he gave a very detailed account. You can actually see the side view of this thing. It took 2 steps and went across the road and went into the woods, and that was the last he saw of it. But he gave a very, very detailed description of what this thing looked like. But he said, besides the fact of what he saw physically, he said it had very muscular legs, and he said it seemed as though it was having trouble walking, didn't move like that of a human. But he said he also saw what appeared to be wings on its back, which were tucked into its body, with the wingtips extending towards the side of its head. And he said, I got on the internet, and he said, I looked all this information up, and he said, the closest thing I could find to describe was a gargoyle.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. That's real. That would make the hairs on my neck stand up for sure.
And there have been other somewhat similar reports received over the years, and it's a very rarity because there's some similarities to the typical Mothman report, but not the same. Not the same as your typical Thunderbird reports, but there have been some other somewhat similar things reported. And Brian Seach, another investigator, told me that he recalled that back in the early 2000s, not far from that area up at they call Lake Arthur, there was another motorist approaching that bridge who saw something on that bridge which also was winged and had a wingspan, and the thing jumped off the bridge and flew off and disappeared. So there's other reports of these things, and if you go to my website and you go down through sighting reports, you can go on there and you'll find other strange creature reports from recent years that are marked on there.
Go ahead and give us the info on your website again, Stan, and also on the books and because the books can be gotten off your website, right?
That's correct. They can also get a copy of Kecksberg DVD, and they want to get a personalized autographed copy of the books. They can go to Stan Gordon, GORDON.info, INFO. And they can also contact me through the website. The email is paufo@comcast.net. And then I also have my hotline number, which they can also call to order the materials. Area code 724-838-7768.
Okay. And now that they can get an autographed copy of your book, is that the case?
Yeah, if people can order them directly through me, they can get the personalized autographed copies directly from me, and we'll get them out to them quite quickly.
Okay, fantastic. It just blows my mind. There's so much is going on in Pennsylvania. We only have a few minutes left. If there's anybody out there that has a question, now would be the time. In the meantime, because I know that you also have gotten reports of cougar and Black Panther sightings. Now, why is that so unusual?
Well, yeah, the mountain lion reports, the cougar are not that unusual because we know the animal exists and they used to exist here in Pennsylvania. But officially, since the late 1890s, they've been declared extinct in the state, but there have been literally hundreds of reports since that time. I mean, I got a very nice casting of a paw print that we took when the police called my group up to investigate a series of mountain lion sightings up in Armstrong County a number of years ago. There have been some very good videos shot of these things, and while I'm convinced, like a lot of the authorities, that some of these are indeed exotic pets that are released into the woods or misidentifications, some reports over the years we've heard of involve allegedly like adult and cubs and more than one adult cat seen at the same time. So some of these reports are very interesting. The Black Panther reports, of course, are much more interesting because no such animals ever exist in this part of the country or part of the world. And there are many reports of these very large, what people would consider to be a Black Panther. And some of those cases are very interesting because there are some more unusual aspects with some of the Black Panther reports, and the fact that in some instances, over the years, you may have a case where you have some Bigfoot activity going on in a certain area, and sometimes during that time you also get Black Panther reports from that same area while the activity is going on. So it's a little more interesting and intriguing. And, you know, with all these creatures, these giant flying things, the Black Panthers, the Bigfoot, people see them, very credible people. They're upset by what they see. Sometimes it's physical evidence in the area, and yet they're there and they're suddenly gone. And with all these reports, why isn't there more evidence? Why has nobody ever found a body?
For people that don't know about the Kecksberg incident, can you fill us in a little bit about what happened that day or that evening?
Oh, sure. I can go back and we could spend days and days just talking about the Kecksberg incident. And this occurred on December 9th, 1965, late afternoon, approximate times around 4:47. Initially, the reports came in from the tip of Ontario, Canada, over Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, of his brilliant fireball, his fiery object moving across the sky. And I can tell a little bit of trivia about it. I remember that evening how things began to unfold on my end was that I was tuning into KDK Radio in Pittsburgh, the big radio station, and they had a talk show. It was called Contact. The host of the show was Mike Levine. And coincidentally, he had a guest on that evening, which I was preparing to listen to. His name was Frank Edwards, who was a reporter who had written some books on flying saucers. And tuned in the radio show and found it fascinating that basically the whole show is being focused on the series of incidents of this fiery object that was seen over the greater Pittsburgh area late that afternoon. And Mike Levine was interviewing witnesses. He was reading the Newswire story reports of it. It became the prominent news story throughout the evening. More and more information was coming in throughout the night. And I was running into the other room to watch the old black and white console TV to see if any reports came in. And lo and behold, KDK TV was breaking in with live reports where they were talking about the incident that something had reportedly fallen out in Westmoreland County, about 40 miles southeast of Pittsburgh. And as time went on, it got much more fascinating because reports came in that the military was now arriving in that small rural community to search for an unidentified flying object. And so it was a very, very fascinating night. I was 16 at the time, wasn't driving yet, and was not able to get out there, and couldn't wait till read the newspaper the next day to see if it was going to be in the paper. And there it was. It was a front-page story in all the local papers, made national Newswire stories. And now what you got to realize is that there was very little detail at that time.
Mm-hmm.
And what I've learned of the case happened over a period of weeks, months, and years.
I'm going to ask you, what was the government? What was the government's official story then? What was the newspaper? What were the newspapers saying it was?
Well, I mean, when you read the local paper, the Greensburg Tribune Review, the first main headline was "Unidentified Flying Object Falls Near Kecksberg," with a subline, "Army ropes offing."
Mm-hmm.
And then moments after it fell, there was a column of kind of a bluish-gray smoke that went up out of the woods, but it dissipated very quickly.
Mm-hmm.
And what we now know is that within a relatively short time after it fell, apparently a number of independent people ran down into the woods to see what it was. And they came across this large, semi-buried, metallic acorn-shaped object down in the wooded ravine.
What color was
it?
Was it copper color? Was it silver?
It was kind of an off gold, copper, bronze color
in
that range, yeah. Now, one witness, and again, now you got to remember, this was 1965. Now, there was very little information initially at that time, and of course, nobody knew exactly where it came down. What we did find out later, years later, was the fact that all these people were on this little, narrow country road that surrounds this large wooded area. But what they didn't know was that the thing actually fell way on the opposite side of the woods, down in a ravine, so they couldn't possibly have seen what fell from where they were.
Mm-hmm.
But there was a number of people that found their way into this little dirt farm road at the time on the opposite side, which is where most of the military activity was going on. And again, while you really couldn't see it down there, if you weren't down in the woods where it fell, you couldn't possibly have seen what it was.
Well, let me ask you this.
Right down at that location. Yes.
How soon after it supposedly landed or fell did the military begin to show up?
Well, there's a lot of stories about that, and I would say the majority of the military activity began to happen within several hours after it fell, where a lot of activity really began to be reported. But there are some people who swear that they began to see at least a military presence. I mean, maybe, let's say, a military jeep, something coming through that general area, not necessarily down at the site because they may not have known where it was, but that they began to see it within maybe an hour after it fell. But we can't 100% be sure of that, okay? And different people said different military vehicles were coming in, in pretty good numbers on different roads. I mean, some people said they actually saw what they described as a military convoy on the Greensburg Mount Pleasant Road, which would be the main road coming into there and also going out. But there's a lot we now know that we didn't know then. And it wasn't until 1987 that we actually had found the first eyewitness to the object on the ground. And how that came about was, for years I would hold these large public UFO displays at a local mall, at the Westmoreland Mall in Greensburg, and it brought thousands of people in. And we didn't have a lot of information on the case back then. But we did have a little display, and there was a lot of people there, and I could see where he was. And, of course, it's dark. They have flashlights. And he said they weren't there very long when these two men in trench coats come down out of the woods, and they're very stern. They tell these guys, this area is now quarantined. You have to get out of here. And right behind them are soldiers coming down out of the woods. And he said the soldiers were so close to him, they were shining the flashlights on each other. But they were told they had to leave the area immediately, and they found their way back into the Kecksberg. When they got down there in that little old truck station they had, he said there was military there. There was military vehicles around there, which other people verified the story. Now, what's intriguing about it is, a number of years before, in the mid-'80s, we were beginning to get some more details on the case, and we began to intensify our investigation. And we were searching down in that general wooded area, and we never told him a thing about it. And while we were looking around there, we came across an area what appeared to be a pattern of tree damage, like a trajectory, where trees were knocked down the same direction, the tops of trees were broken out. We got a pretty good idea where we felt that something probably had fallen. We told him nothing. So he offered to go out to the area with us. He hadn't been there since 1965, so that was 1987. He walked around out there for quite a long time, and we said nothing to him at all. And he remembered certain details about the landscape, and he remembered something in particular about that immediate area. And he walked around, he found that area, and he said, you know what, guys, I think we're right on the spot. And I looked at my associate, and we couldn't believe it, because that was right in the area we felt this thing probably had fallen. Now, a year later, we got an anonymous tip that there was another local witness who had seen the object soon after it fell. That was Bill Bullybush. He lived in Mammoth right over the hill. So we got a hold of him, and he'd never come forward, but he verified, yes, indeed, he had seen this thing. And so he was willing to meet with us. Now, you got to understand, this is a large, large wooded area, and there's a lot of ways to get in and out of there. Well, Bill Bullybush was down on the other side of the hill near Mammoth, and that afternoon, late afternoon, he was out there in his car in the driveway tuning in his CB radio, and he heard some radio reports about this thing. He happened to look up to see this fiery object through the windshield of a vehicle heading from the little village of Norville out towards the mountain of Laurelville. So he ran out of the vehicle, went out to the edge of the driveway, and watched that thing move off in the distance up to the mountains. He said it kind of hesitated, kind of turned, and made a turn back towards Kecksburg. So he jumps into his car, and he goes up to the highest outlook, which that road they now nicknamed, they called Meteor Road. And he went up there, and it was almost dark. And he knew the area of the woods because he hunted down there. And as he's standing up there down in the woods, I was apparently out for lunch or something at the time, and a fellow was talking to one of my associates there, and they were talking about Kecksburg, and this man and his family happened to walk by, and he was standing there kind of listening to the conversation, and they said, excuse me, you talking about the incident out there in Kecksburg? And they said, yeah, and he said, well, I was a member of the search team that found the object. Well, of course, my assistant grabs him over the side, and he starts talking, and he says, first thing, like, look, guys, I don't want involved in this thing, I don't want my family involved, but they got a hold of me, and we talked, and he was offered to talk to us privately about it. Well, that turned out to be Jim Romansky, but it didn't go public until 1990, when Unsolved Mysteries did the season premiere on the show.
Okay.
But Jim was not from Kecksburg. He said that he was a volunteer fireman from one of the outside mutual aid fire companies and was called out to assist in the search of a possible downed aircraft in the Kecksburg area. So Jim's story was very detailed. He gave a lot of very good details and told certain things that if you weren't there, you couldn't have known. And anyhow, what his story was that he was called out to that scene with others. He did know most of the firemen there because they were from other communities. And they were going to conduct a search in the woods around there for what they thought was a possible downed aircraft. So he was with a small team, and they had walkie-talkies, and they weren't out in the woods very long when they got a radio call from another team that they had come across this object over by, another area over there. So they hurried over, and he's standing with others on this little embankment looking down at this object only several feet away, which is semi-buried in the ground. Now, they knew what a meteorite would have looked like. They knew aircraft, and they realized that this was something unlike anything he'd ever seen before. Now, Jim had been a machinist all his life, and he said this was the strangest looking color of metal he had ever seen. And he described it, he said, it looked like somebody took liquid metal and poured it into an acorn-shaped mold. And he estimated, from what he could tell, this thing's about 10 to 12 feet or more in length, about 8 to 10 feet in diameter, big enough for a human to stand inside of.
Okay.
At the bottom of the raised-up area, like where your acorn would be at the back, he said there were these raised-up markings on it. And he said it wasn't like letters, it was more like symbols.
But now let me ask you this.
Defined.
I'm sorry to cut it to you, but if that was buried in the ground, how could he...
Semi-buried. Part of it was raised up out of the ground.
Got it.
Because it was underneath. This was raised up above the ground.
Okay, got it. Okay.
So anyhow, they're standing there several feet away, and they're looking at this thing. And he said there's no rivets, no seams, no fuselage, no weld marks, except for those unusual markings raised up on it. And they're amazed at what they're looking at there, and they couldn't see any way to get in or out of it from what area. And then the next edition of the paper had a number of different stories in it, but one of the main stories that stood out was that searchers failed to find object. And it goes on to say that, yes, there was a search, but absolutely nothing was found in the woods, that the official line was that people had seen a bright meteor in the sky, that nothing had fallen, and officially that's how it remains today. Now, I can tell you, I remember very clearly within days after this happened that there was all kind of talk about this around the local community, and there was reports that people had seen a large military flatbed tractor-trailer truck carrying a large tarp object away from that area late that night at a high rate of speed. Of course, that wasn't mentioned in the newspapers. But I can tell you just a little bit of the story as the things go on that night. So anyhow, what we do know is this. This story is being broadcast all over the Pittsburgh area from the local radio news media. And literally hundreds of people came in from western Pennsylvania, descended into this small little farming community to try to see what this object was that had fallen on the ground. So not only did you have lots of people, but you also had reporters that came in from all the major Pittsburgh area radio, TV, and newspapers, who themselves became witnesses to the fact that while they didn't see the object, as most people couldn't from where they were, a lot of them reported verifying the fact that they saw a military presence on the scene that night. And what most people reported, again, now we know, is that there was a lot of what they believed to be Army. People reported Air Force. Some people, now we interviewed some witnesses who claimed that they either had contact with or saw what appeared to be NASA personnel on the scene that night as well.
Okay.
And very, very interesting story. Now, here's what we know now that we didn't know back at that time.
Okay.
This object, as it comes in over the greater Pittsburgh area. It moves out roughly southeast into Westmoreland County. This object moves in over the city of Greensburg, where I live, and it tracked out roughly out towards Route 30 east. But between Greensburg and Latrobe, it made a turn to the south. And people all along that area, all these little farming communities, see this object moving out there across the sky, moving out towards the mountains near Laurelville. And some witnesses say that object kind of hesitated, made another turn, began to head back towards Kecksberg, made another turn and went down into the woods. Now, those people who saw this object actually go down said this thing did not come down at a high rate of speed, like, for example, a re-entry of space junk or a meteorite. It came down relatively slow, like some people said, almost like a controlled landing.